Well, thank you first of all for having me, and I'm taking this talk a little bit as an opportunity to throw out ideas that are maybe not quite as thought out as they should be, and I'm looking forward to you telling me just that. And I'm also probably touching on a few points that the subsequent speakers on this panel are going to make much better than I will make them, or will really provide you with much better data on than I will provide you with on. But what I want to talk about briefly is really a few things related to the overall topic of certainly the NERT, but also of this meeting. And one thing that I find fairly fascinating is the fact that we're even still talking about this. I mean, we've certainly been doing research on this for decades and decades. We've gone through a dozen technologies trying to figure out how one talks about risk and how one communicates risk well. And here we are. And a lot of the presenters are saying, well, we're really at the beginning of this research and we really don't know yet. And so that's one of the reasons, or one of the things I want to talk about is why that is. Second, I want to show you some of the data that we've collected, or that comes from elsewhere, about how, and I'm really approaching this, and this particular panel certainly is devoted to this, from a media perspective. So kind of how do media and public attitudes interact. And then my third bullet point, when I initially wrote it, I wrote it up as lessons, which is very German, so I kind of took that out and called this a few thoughts on how to maybe do it better. Rather on lessons on how to do it better. But kind of the idea is, well, there are a few things I think that research really suggests work or should work, and we haven't really pursued them as much as we should have, and I want to touch on some of them. So really quickly, nano certainly is everywhere. You've seen all these numbers depending on who you listen to. If it's the NSF or if it's Lux, we're talking $3.1 trillion industries. We're talking 600 plus consumer end products. Federal funding that has almost quadrupled, exponential increases in media coverage, certainly from what we've been seeing, but absolutely no change when it comes to knowledge levels. And we had a chance earlier to talk a little bit in smaller groups about how to measure knowledge. One of the things that we have done in the past at various stages, and I apologize here for the breaks in the titles. In my computer, they don't work out that way. But the idea that what we did is we asked people true-false questions, and 6 of them in national telephone surveys in 2004, and then most recently in 2007, about what they knew about nanotechnology, and did they think it was true or false that most experts considered nano the next scientific revolution, that nano is visible to the naked eye, what the definition for nanometer is, and so on. They were asked obviously randomly in telephone surveys in random order for each respondent, but I grouped them here into 3 different groups. One, economic implications on the left, basic nano knowledge, and then specific nano knowledge. And what you see pretty much is what happens is that if it's the more general questions, yes, has economic impacts, people kind of know. It's really small and you can't see it, well, it goes down a little bit, and when you ask about real technical definitions, not surprisingly, people don't know. And don't know means, for true-false questions, 50-50, right? 1 million Americans flip a coin. The more interesting thing, though, is the difference between the red and the yellow. And that's why I was saying nano's everywhere. We have exponential increases in media coverage. We are spending a lot of money. We're spending 40 million or so on social implications a year. Yet there's absolutely no change between 2004 and 2007 in terms of knowledge levels. When we look at support, and this is, again, 2004 and 2007, equivalent surveys, national surveys. And we also broke it down into 2 groups here. People who said beforehand that they had been aware before we did the interview of nanotechnology as a new scientific breakthrough, and people who said, well, I was really kind of not aware of this. The support in general among the aware public is much higher than among the unaware if we ask them in surveys, and that really hasn't changed all that much either. So if people know little, if they have learned nothing, and we still have these differences between the aware and the unaware, what is happening? What's actually going on as people are making these decisions? And one of the answers comes from research that you're all aware of, and this is Dan Kahneman's and Amos Tversky's research on framing and prospect theory. And one of the things that and I think one of the best summaries you can really get of this, either as webcasting, if you watch the Nobel Prize speech, or that chapter that came out of Kahneman's Nobel Prize speech for the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, is he's talking about these framing effects really being extremely strong for ambiguous stimuli. So for a stimulus that I can interpret in different ways. That is not a clear piece of information. And science, of course, in many ways is that perfect ambiguous stimulus. And this is taken directly from Kahneman's slides here. If you look at this symbol, it could be a 1 and a 3, it could be a B. How you interpret this particular symbol depends to a large degree on what the framework is that I put it in. And so on the left-hand side, you see the exact same symbol embedded in 2 letters, and then the exact same set of symbols embedded in a series of numbers. And obviously, depending on how you see it and depending on what the framework is surrounding this, you're going to look at this as a set of numbers or as a set of letters. And that has huge implications for certainly how we talk about something like nanotechnology that a lot of people see as exactly that ambiguous stimulus. We've heard a lot of conversations today about how you can approach this from a moral angle, from an ethical angle, from a trust angle, from a whole range of things. Why does this matter for nanotechnology? Well, this is one article from the MIT Technology Review back in May, talking about how multi-walled carbon nanotubes may cause cancer. Let's assume I'm a lay audience member. I'm reading this. I am kind of interested in science and technology, but certainly not an expert in nanotechnology. Well, 2 months later, I'm reading this article from the Washington Post that says, well, carbon nanotubes, which could cause cancer, remember previous slide, also help to cure cancer. So do they cause cancer or do they cure cancer? And certainly from a scientific perspective, these two pieces of information are in no way, shape, or form contradictory. But from a lay perspective, they are very contradictory. From somebody who is not an expert on nanotechnology, but who is really a casual reader of even the New York Times science section or Science News Online. So the problem is nano turns out to be in many ways that perfect ambiguous stimulus, which is also why communication about nanotechnology can be so powerful and why some of the framing effects that Dan Kahan was talking about certainly are particularly powerful. What are these framing effects? And we have talked about this quite a bit without really necessarily getting at the theory, so I want to briefly mention this. And up here you see the example of the frosted fakes. We've heard a number of references to GMOs. Kellogg's Frosted Fakes, the Greenpeace campaign against genetically modified organisms, and Tony the Frankentiger, certainly one of the best frames that I have seen and best in terms of effectiveness frames that I've seen. Because even if you have never heard a single piece of information about genetically modified organisms, you get an idea of what the argument is. And for you, that new technology is pretty well embedded into what you already know. So frames really have very little to do with information. They're not about telling you one thing versus another thing. They're not about giving you different pieces of information. And remember Dan Kahan's articles that were the exact same piece of information, or Kahneman's 1 and 3, which was the exact same piece of information that I'm giving you. I'm just framing it in different ways. What differs is the way they present issues. So the idea that we're talking about GMOs or frankenfood, that we talk about nano as the next plastic versus the next asbestos. And so what frames really do cognitively is every piece of information that I process, I can put in various cognitive bins in my head. And that is a matter of effectiveness and of effectively processing information. I'm not going to start a new category system every single time. I have existing category systems to make sense of new information. Well, which category I'm using is heavily influenced by the frame that is being offered to me. So am I talking about nano as a moral issue and put that in that bin along with, I don't know, maybe GMOs, maybe something that really questions my religious beliefs? Or am I going to put it in there somewhere in a regulatory bin that talks about nano, very similar to asbestos, for instance? Well, this is where the government has screwed up, and where 20 years from now we're going to live with the unintended consequences. So the reason why frames are so important is because media obviously rely on frames. And they rely on frames not because they want to mislead the public, but because that is a key tool to